Las Vegas, mid-1970s. The lights burned gold across the showroom. Halfway through a ballad, Elvis stopped. A young mother held her newborn in the front row, tiny blanket catching the stage glow. The king stepped forward. If moments of kindness like this touch you, make sure you stay until the end, because what Elvis whispered that night left an entire crowd in tears. The brass section hit its mark. Guitars thrummed, and the showroom floor shook with applause. It was Las Vegas, mid-1970s, where every seat in the packed hall pressed tight against the stage. The red velvet curtains framed Elvis Presley in his gleaming white jumpsuit, rhinestones catching each golden beam of the spotlight. His voice was steady, commanding, and the band knew every cue by heart. Then, without warning, Elvis raised his left hand. The drummer froze mid. Brass cut off in a jagged breath. A single guitar chord hung and died. The entire showroom fell into silence, the sudden stillness so sharp it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Glasses clinked in the distance, and the faint hum of the amplifiers became the only sound. All eyes went to the king. Elvis's gaze, however, was fixed somewhere else. The spotlight shifted, following his subtle nod. Its beam landed on a young woman in the front row. She looked startled, unsure at first why hundreds of faces suddenly turned toward her. Cradled in her arms was a newborn, wrapped snug in a pastel blanket that caught the light and shimmered softly against the darkened crowd. Witnesses recall how the mother gently rocked the child, almost as if she'd been trying to keep the moment private. No waving hands, no sign asking for attention. She was simply there, holding her baby, lost in the music until Elvis stopped everything. He lowered the mic stand, easing it toward the floor so he could lean forward. The audience murmured, confused, curious, restless. A few ushers traded worried glances. Breaking rhythm mid-song wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. Yet Elvis seemed calm, even deliberate. The white suit glowed under the spotlight as he adjusted the collar with one hand, eyes never leaving the mother. Then, to the surprise of everyone in the room, he smiled. It wasn't his stage smile, the wide, practiced grin. It was smaller, more human, almost tender. The audience stilled again. You could hear the shuffle of someone in the back row adjusting their seat, the faint hiss of an overworked amp, even the rustle of the baby's blanket. Each sound carried like a note in an unfinished song. People leaned forward, whispering to each other. What's he doing? Who is she? The mother's face flushed, her lips trembling as she realized the king of rock and roll was looking only at her child. This was not part of the show. It was a disruption, a risk. An artist in front of thousands, abandoning the script for a single moment of focus. Why would Elvis Presley, who never missed a note, bring an entire performance to a halt for one mother and her baby? The crowd didn't know it yet, but that pause would lead to one of the most unforgettable gestures of his career. What would the king do next? He had a reputation. Elvis Presley might have been the biggest name on the marquee, but in the crowd, he never overlooked a single soul. Fans told stories of it for years, how he spotted a cardboard sign held by a girl in the last row, or how he bent down to catch a single tear on the cheek of a grieving widow. He could sense the smallest details in a sea of thousands, and somehow he made those moments part of the show. Tonight was no different. The mother in the front row hadn't come to stand out. She wasn't waving her arms or calling his name. She was rocking her newborn gently, her head bent low, almost hidden by the blanket. To most people in the showroom, she blended into the crowd. But Elvis saw her. Some say it was instinct. Others believe it was the way he carried himself, always scanning, searching for the human thread in the spectacle. What's certain is that he noticed her when no one else did. From the side of the stage, ushers exchanged whispers. One leaned to another and muttered, "What's happening? Why'd he stop?" Their confusion mirrored the crowd. People shifted in their seats, straining to see past the glare of the stage lights. Then came the micro-moment that shifted. Everything. Elvis lifted his chin toward the mother, just enough for her to know he meant her. He raised his hand again, but this time it wasn't to silence the band. It was a small, deliberate gesture, his finger pointing gently, his eyes locked with hers. The mother froze, startled. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She clutched the baby tighter. The crowd leaned forward, hundreds of bodies moving in unison, as though the entire room was holding the same breath. And then Elvis did something no one expected. He stepped down, not off stage completely, not yet. Just one step, his polished boots shining under the light as he descended from the raised platform. It was subtle, but to the people in the room, it felt monumental. The brass section exchanged glances. Guitarists shifted nervously. Even the drummer who had followed Presley through years of touring looked uneasy. Stopping the music was one thing. Leaving the safety of the stage was another. This wasn't scripted, but Elvis never looked back. A fan sitting near the front later recalled, "I thought he was going to hand her something, maybe a scarf. But then I realized he was just looking at her like she was the only person there." The mother, overwhelmed, lifted the baby's head just slightly. For a fleeting second, the spotlight caught the child's pale face, the tiny nose, the faint trace of dark hair. The blanket shimmered as the baby stirred. The audience gasped. A wave of emotion spread through the showroom, whispers darting from table to table, and yet silence reigned. Elvis let it. He let the silence stretch, his boots planted firmly on the lower stair, his eyes still locked on the young woman. In that pause, the crowd realized something. The king wasn't breaking character. He was showing his truest one. The suspense built with each passing second. People in the farthest rows craned their necks, desperate to know what was he going to do. Even his band, the men who had played every city, every show, leaned in. They had never seen him like this. And then came the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. What would happen next when Elvis took the next step? The king was moving closer. The entire room waited to see just how far he would go. The gasp rippled through the crowd the moment Elvis took the second step down. It was small, almost careful, but in that hushed room it felt seismic. No one expected him to break the invisible wall between performer and audience. His white scarf fluttered against the rhinestones on his chest. With a fluid motion, he pulled it loose from around his neck. For a moment, the crowd thought it would be like the dozens of shows before a Elvis offering a scarf to a screaming fan. But this was different. His focus was not on the outstretched hands or the flashing cameras. It was locked on a mother and her child. Security tensed. One guard stepped forward, but Elvis waved him off with a subtle shake of the head. The musicians glanced nervously at one another, unsure whether to play or wait. A guitar chord, struck by habit, hung awkwardly in the air before fading into silence. Then Elvis kneeled, on the carpeted step, just feet away from the young woman. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers. The spotlight framed the moment, catching the curve of his jaw, the glimmer of sweat on his temple. The crowd leaned in so hard that even the sound of someone's chair scraping on the tile floor rang out sharp. "Ma'am," Elvis said softly, his voice carrying through the hushed microphone, "that baby." He paused, eyes flicking down to the blanket, then back to her. His words were simple, stripped of the stage persona. "Looks like an angel." The room broke. Applause surged, mixed with gasps and cries, but just as quickly, the sound dissolved back into reverent quiet. The mother's lips trembled, her eyes glistening. She adjusted the blanket slightly, revealing the baby's face to the man kneeling before her. The child stirred, a small fist poking free. For a moment, everyone braced for a cry, but it never came. The baby blinked beneath the golden light, calm, almost curious. Witnesses later described that second as holy. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even music. It was silence, raw and unplanned, turned into something sacred by the presence of one man willing to break script. The mother swallowed hard, unable to speak. Elvis tilted his head just slightly, smiling with a tenderness that surprised even those who knew him best. His hand, scarf still dangling loosely, reached out not to touch, not yet, but to close the space between them with a gesture of respect. From the back rows, people rose to their feet, straining to see. The hush was no longer confusion. It was awe. Fans who had waited years to hear him sing now found themselves swept up in a moment without a single note. The stage lights dimmed slightly, leaving Elvis and the mother in sharper relief against the shadowed crowd. It felt as though the thousands of people in the room had been reduced to just three: the king, the mother, and the child. Then, as if pulled by an unseen rhythm, Elvis shifted closer. His scarf brushed against the baby's blanket. The child blinked again, and the mother gasped, covering her mouth as fresh tears streamed down. The audience could barely breathe. What was happening was no longer a concert, it was something deeper, something no ticket could ever promise. And yet, even in that intimacy, a question lingered in the air. What would he say next? Because the king was not done. Not yet. The crowd waited for the words that would define this unforgettable pause in history. The room felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to match the steady rhythm of Elvis's breath. His kneel had stilled the crowd, but what came next bound them even tighter. He leaned forward, closer to the young mother, so close that the microphone no longer picked up his voice. From the stage monitors came nothing but the faint hiss of electricity. The brass section, instruments lowered, watched with unease. Even the drummer rested his sticks against the snare, waiting. The king's lips moved. At first no one knew what he said. Only those within a few feet could hear it. Later, witnesses would share the line with hushed reverence. "This child will grow up knowing they were loved from the very first day." The words hit like lightning. The mother's reaction was instant. Tears welled and spilled as she clutched the baby tighter against her chest. Her shoulders shook, her face crumpling with gratitude and disbelief. The crowd may not have heard his exact whisper, but they saw the effect, and that was enough. For a brief moment, the world shrank to that single triangle of light. Elvis, the mother, the child. He rested one hand gently on the edge of the blanket, not quite touching the infant, but near enough for the gesture to feel like a blessing. And then, the shift. Elvis looked back at the audience. His smile broadened, transforming from tender to reassuring. He stood, slow but steady, rising from his kneel with the grace of a man returning to his throne. The spotlight followed, widening once more to pull the crowd back into the story. A cheer erupted, waves of applause crashing like surf. But this wasn't the typical frenzy of fans screaming his name. It was cathartic, emotional, almost reverent. People stood to their feet, clapping through tears, some even holding each other. Elvis adjusted the scarf in his hand, then held it aloft. The crowd roared, expecting him to toss it into the sea of grasping arms. Instead, he turned back to the mother, leaned once more, and tucked it carefully into the folds of the baby's blanket. Gasps rippled through the room. The band, sensing their cue, struck a single soft chord. It wasn't the song they had been playing. It was quieter, humbler, almost improvised. Elvis didn't rush them. He nodded gently, then addressed the audience for the first time since stopping the show. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Sometimes the Lord sends us reminders of what matters most." The audience erupted against him in applause, others in tears, and yet the most powerful part of the night wasn't the words over the microphone. It was the words only one woman ever truly heard. A fan seated in the middle rows later recalled, "I couldn't hear what he said, but I'll never forget the way she broke down crying. That told me it was something real." The scene ended as quickly as it had begun. Elvis straightened, nodded once more at the mother, then turned back toward the band. The music swelled, the show resumed, and the crowd tried to collect themselves, though many never would. But backstage, in the hours that followed, whispers continued. Crew members spoke of how Elvis had broken the flow of a sold-out performance to deliver a message meant for one person. They wondered what it meant to her, and whether the moment would stay private or ripple outward forever. The crowd thought the story was over. They didn't know that after the show, something else would happen, something almost no one would ever see. The concert ended in a thunder of applause. Fans surged to the edge of the stage, shouting his name, desperate for one more glimpse, one more wave. But behind the curtain, Elvis's focus was elsewhere. He had one final task that night. According to crew members, he didn't go straight to his dressing room. Instead, he paused at the side of the stage and called over a member of his security team. "Make sure she's safe," he said quietly. "The lady with the baby. Bring them back." The guard nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Minutes later, the young mother was ushered through a side hallway, away from the crush of fans pouring into the lobby. She still held the child tight, rocking him gently, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. In a small, dimly lit lounge backstage, someone handed her a folded slip of paper. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. Strong, slanted letters, signed EP. The note read, "Every child deserves to feel the music. Thank you for sharing yours tonight. Elvis Presley." Her hands shook as she unfolded the message. She pressed it to her lips, overwhelmed, before tucking it carefully back into the folds of the baby's blanket. Witnesses recall she wasn't empty-handed when she left, wrapped in the pastel cloth against her newborn. The white scarf Elvis had placed earlier remained, carrying the faint scent of his cologne and the warmth of the stage lights. Fans outside who caught sight of her later remembered how she held it as though it were made of gold. Security escorted her to a waiting car, keeping her shielded from the chaos. Outside, the night air buzzed with electricity, fans buzzing about the interruption they'd witnessed. For most, the story ended there, with Elvis's brief pause on stage. The whisper, the scarf. But for the mother, the moment had only deepened. She sat in the car, her baby nestled against her. and read the note again under the glow of the street lamp. The words were simple, but to her they felt eternal. A private message, handwritten by the most famous man in the world, meant only for her and her child. As the car pulled away, she glanced back at the neon lights of the casino marquee. The cheers of fans still echoed faintly in the distance. Yet in her hands was something greater than any encore proof of kindness that had been real, personal, and hers to carry, dot and still. The story wasn't finished, because what happened the following week would turn one private gesture into a family legend. Would this night fade quietly into memory, or would Elvis ensure the child carried a piece of it forever? A week passed. The young mother likely thought the story had ended, that the note, the scarf, and the memory would be all she would carry from that night. But then a package arrived at her home. It bore the return address of Graceland. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a small, polished silver rattle, its handle engraved with 3 simple words, "With love, Elvis Presley." She gasped, holding it up to the light. The baby stirred in her arms, the faint jingle of the rattle ringing softly in the quiet of their living room. Tears filled her eyes again, different this time, not from shock, but from the weight of knowing the gesture had followed her home. This wasn't just a souvenir. It was a family heirloom, delivered from the most famous entertainer in the world, yet meant only for her child. Neighbors would later say she told the story often as the boy grew, not as a tale about Elvis, the star, but Elvis, the man, the one who stopped a show in front of thousands to remind her that her child was loved. The rattle, carefully preserved, became a symbol not of fame, but of kindness. Elvis Presley filled arenas with sound. His voice shook walls, and his image lit up marquees. But what people closest to him remembered most were moments like this, when he turned away from spectacle to focus on something small, human, eternal. That night in Las Vegas proved it. He had silenced a showroom not with music, but with compassion, and in doing so, he left behind a story carried for generations. Fame fades. Kindness, DOESN. Single quotes: if this story moved you, share it with someone who believes a single kind word can last a lifetime. And tell me, what would you have whispered if you were in Elvis's place?